I think they're trying to pull people out of the installation by Isaac, but it's proving difficult. They are absorbed, they've forgotten where they are, they're lost, and we're trying to remind them that we're all in here now. Welcome everybody to the Memorial Art Gallery. My name is Jonathan Binstock, I'm the director. I'm very glad to see you here today. It's a wonderful turnout for a very important afternoon. There's a lot of people to thank on a project of this scale. I'm going to be very general in my remarks, and I'm going to say thank you to the Board of Managers, members of whom are here. Thank you to the Art Committee of the Memorial Art Gallery. Members of that committee are here. The staff of the Memorial Art Gallery. This has been a 3-year journey, bringing an installation of this scale and importance to Rochester. Lessons of the Hour, Frederick Douglass by Isaac Julien. And I can tell you that it has been exciting, it has been fun, it has been grueling. It is not an easy task, and I really do want to say thank you to our staff, to our volunteers, to our board leadership for being on the team, picking up an oar and making it happen. It's an extraordinary accomplishment. I feel this is a very important moment for the Memorial Art Gallery. And I'm just so grateful to be here, and I'm so grateful to you to welcome to this afternoon's event, a conversation between curator John Hanhart and artist Isaac Julien. I'll introduce each of them separately, and then we're along for the ride. John Hanhart is our consulting senior curator of media arts. He has been working with us for almost 3 years, and he is doing for the Memorial Art Gallery what he has done throughout his career for other museums. I can name them all: the Walker Art Center, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Guggenheim Museum, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. John has been a curator of media arts, a senior curator at these institutions over many decades, the many decades of his career. And he has introduced the art of the moving image to these institutions. When you walk into the Whitney Museum of Art and you're surrounded by screens and moving images, the reason why they're there is because John paved the way for them to be there. He came up with the pioneering generation of media artists and curators in the 70s. He was born and raised in Rochester, educated at the Brighton Central School District, woo, hometown hero, and he is a graduate of the University of Rochester. Even better. And he went out into the world, changed the cultural landscape of the world by institutionalizing in the best possible way the art of the moving image, which was not an easy task, of course. I mean, really coming up with that, the first generation of those artists, working with them to make it possible for this work to be exhibited and stewarded and preserved and studied and so forth. I mean, at this point in his career, he is the managing editor of the Andy Warhol film catalog Raisonné. He is working on a major exhibition of Bill Viola for the Barnes Foundation. He is one of the world's experts in the art of Nam June Paik. He's really a luminary in the field, and he's doing for us in his hometown what he has done for all these institutions. He is introducing the art of the moving image to the Memorial Art Gallery, to Rochester. He is changing this institution, helping it to grow, and as a result, he is expanding the cultural footprint of Rochester, New York. Please join me in welcoming to the stage John Hanhart.
After that introduction.
We're just getting going.
We're just kidding.
Isaac Julien is a global artist. And I'm not referring to the fact that, I have a list here, that his work is collected by institutions such as, but not limited to, the Tate in London, the Museum of Modern Art, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Guggenheim Museum, the Hirshhorn, the Albright Knox, the Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris, Luma Foundation in Arles, the Kramlich Collection in San Francisco, the Zeitz Museum of Contemporary African Art in Cape Town. I mean, the list goes on. Museums all over the world exhibit this person's art and collect it and steward it for the future. It is not for this reason that Isaac is a global artist. Isaac is a global artist because he finds inspiration in locations around the world to make his art. He has made major film projects and installations in Iceland, in the United Kingdom, where he lives. He's from East London and lives in London, and as a bit of background, parents from St. Lucia. Isaac grew up in the UK. Projects made in France, in North Africa, the Caribbean, China. His new project, which he's already set to working on, Lina Bobardi, was shot in Brazil. That opens in June of this year. And of course, the United States. But the thing is, it's hard to get this man's attention. He hasn't been in the United States since 2003. Well, he's been in the United States a lot because we're busy showing his work all over the place, but he hasn't made a work in the United States since Baltimore and 2003. And actually, the city of Baltimore plays an important role in the installation here at the Memorial Art Gallery because it is where Frederick Douglass lived and learned to read, and from which he escaped to New York City as a slave. Those drone shots, you'll get to that. The drone shots are of Baltimore. Okay, so he has made installations and works of art called Fantôme Afrique, Stones Against Diamonds, 10,000 Waves, Western Union Small Boats, Playtime, True North. Looking for Langston from 1989 was the beginning, in a way, the launch of a career and of a reputation for perfection. Baltimore, Paradise Omeros. Isaac has a way of, and this is the part I hadn't planned out in my talk, Isaac has a way of synthesizing an understanding of the past that brings its relevance into the present and helps us to understand how we all connect in the context of history. I really believe that most people can connect with his art. He has figured out how to warmly welcome an audience into his incredibly complicated and ambitious installations and to help them experience history and the present in ways that really do change how we view the world and hopefully how our place in the world. And the piece here, Lessons of the Hour, has certainly done that for me. I've been waiting to say this. He is a commander of the most excellent order of the British Empire. Awarded, yes, in 2017 by the Queen of England. I'm actually going to just welcome you up to the stage. We're so proud and so grateful and so humbled to have you here in Rochester, for Rochester to have become a part of your global palette and your global vision. Thank you for your work. It is going to elevate the conversation on art in Rochester. It is going to help the Memorial Art Gallery connect with the community in ways it has never connected with the community. It is going to show us a Frederick Douglass that we didn't know, a Frederick Douglass who lived in many places, including many, many months, years even, in the UK. For this, we are very grateful. You've changed the conversation here, I would say, for at least a generation. So, Isaac, please join us.
Wow. Well, I just want to begin by saying what a pleasure this is, because this is really, a fruition of a dream to, it's also, for a curator, the ability to make the opportunity to see an artist create a new work. I mean, this is the most powerful, most extraordinary thing one can do. It really it supports the artist, and it makes something very special possible. Now, I've been very privileged to know Isaac for many years, and artist whose career I follow very carefully, and an artist I've learned a lot from. That's again the privilege of being a curator involved with artists, is to be able to spend time with them and to learn their practice and the ideas and issues that inform their work. It's a great intellectual adventure to see work being made. Now, this is a project that, with overall title, Reflections on Place, and I think it's very important in thinking about Frederick Douglass, about how place was important to him, not only Rochester. And I just want to point this out. This is a brochure I was given by Carvin Eisen, a wonderful member of the community here, world community, but Rochester community, doing wonderful things in support of Frederick Douglass's legacy and showing his relevance to the communities of this city. I can't thank him enough for that. But this is, visiting the sites that are important to Frederick Douglass were part of the introduction when we brought Isaac to Rochester. And now I want to say is that this conversation is going to be a deep dive into the making of the work. You're going to be the first audience to gain access to photographs documenting the production, the realization of the piece. So this is a fantastic opportunity. I'm looking forward to it. Isaac in the studio prepared hundreds of images, so I'm just going to be moving through these, asking some questions, and beginning to think about this work in terms of what it is and what it means to make an artwork involving 10 panels of moving images, and images that have been created through a process of investigation and research to learn who Frederick Douglass was, what his life was, and its importance and relevance to us today. I mean, seeing the work for the first time became a tremendously emotional experience for me, and it's been for many of the folks here. So for those of you who haven't seen it yet, you're in for a big treat, and what we're going to show and talk to you about, you'll be able to say, there I see, that's where it came from. And for those of you who have seen the work, I hope this will add that much more insight to the understanding of the work. This doesn't just pop out of the studio. This isn't just sort of, there it is. It involves, and I have to say Jonathan is referring to a complex, challenging process. Of course it's challenging. He's making a new work. He's pushing the medium. And we're here as museums to support these artists to realize this work. So I'm thrilled with what the Memorial Art Gallery has done. And Jonathan and his staff and team have been so supportive. You know, it's just brought so much energy to it. It's been a big challenge, and the muscles of this institution have developed and grown, and I think it's very important, exciting. So with this, I'm going to begin to, well, first of all, Isaac, I just want to ask you a bit about Frederick Douglass in terms of his attraction. You know, what drew you immediately to him when we began our conversation?
Well, I think two things. I mean, I think, of course, I mean, Frederick Douglass was someone that I had become familiarized with when I was teaching at Harvard on the invitation of Henry Louis Gates Jr. in African American Studies Department. And I had come across a book that, well, we call him Skip, that Skip had written called Figures in Black, and he has a whole chapter on Frederick Douglass. So that's when I first became familiarized with Frederick Douglass. But I think I only became really familiarized with Frederick Douglass when you took me on the tour in Rochester and going to see this kind of amazing statue of him with Goethe on one side and Frederick Douglass on the other, and conversations about Susan B. Anthony, then going on to the university and really beginning to realize this amazing archive. Of course, I think one of the other things for me in relationship to Frederick Douglass was the fact that he had been sort of not really properly, in a way, portrayed in film, in the moving image. I think there's a minute when he's in glory, and then there's a very early film which was made by William Greaves, but he hasn't really been like visually explored. And I think, you know, during the sort of early research, and then again I'm giving a nod to Skip Gates, who's always at the forefront of these things, I came across a wonderful book called Picturing Douglass, and then came across an amazing essay which he had written called Lecture on Pictures. And I was kind of flabbergasted by it, because the fact that he had written this text in 19th century, which precedes Walter Benjamin, by at least 70 years, for me was a kind of revelation that you could have someone who, you know, in a sense was like slave philosopher, you know, talk in this incredibly sophisticated way about photography. And yeah, so in that sense, I felt that it was very prophetic.
Yeah.
And then I felt with Douglass, you know, there was the Douglass that we were familiarized with in his many important lectures. But then there was this sort of inner Douglass world, which was fascinating. And as I sort of went more into exploring the project, more things developed and came out, which I think will be revealed in these slides and talks.
Yeah, I think when we went to the University of Rochester, the Rusheries Library, we're seeing here some of the daguerreotypes and photographs of Frederick Douglass. He was the most photographed American of the 19th century. So he had an enormous presence. And being able to, you know, one of the things about Isaac work is his firsthand textual research, you know, picking up on a particular text of his that hadn't been much discussed. And through the way he's working with the moving image, it became right to the surface as a way to reflect on his whole way of imagining the world, Douglass's way of thinking. And this is Anna Murray Douglass. This is his first wife. Again, images from his life. And of course, this statue, which we can't seem to leave because it's so important. It's such a sign of Frederick Douglass's importance. In the library, I want to point out this extraordinary image. I'll never forget when we came across this.
Yeah.
It was like a, oh my God, moment showing Helen Pitts, Frederick Douglass' second wife, in this cartoon, in a newspaper. What was it? I mean, this was important both in terms of his representation, but also in terms of his costuming and how you could see it.
Yes, because I looked at it and I thought, my God, what a beautifully drawn kind of, I can't believe it. You know, it's a fantastic kind of, you know, lithograph or, you know, painting, drawing, you know. But then, as I looked at it a little bit more, I realized that, in fact, it had a rather insidious aspect
Yes.
to it because it actually had incredibly racist undertones and in fact was a kind of propagandistic image of Douglass, both in a way, you know, chastising him for his second wife, Helen Pitts, who was a white abolitionist, suffragette. Her parents were both abolitionists, had this long abolitionist history. And of course, there was a reference to kind of sulfur bitters, you know, and then all of this under reading and, you know, the boys on the side. And of course, pictorially, I mean, these were the kinds of things which Douglass disliked rather a lot. And one of the reasons why he wasn't real sort of supporter of photography and interested in what could be then seen as the truth of photography in going beyond the way in which sort of, you know, African Americans were being portrayed sort of generally in the culture. But I think this was a pivotal moment in the archives here, coming across this image, because it gave me other clues in relationship to how he dressed, to how he carried himself, a kind of gentleman of, you know, 19th century, a Victorian to a certain extent, and obviously someone who has achieved a certain position in the society.
And here, you know, from that and from the research that Isaac was doing, the idea of developing the cast, the characters, Ray Farron, who plays Frederick Douglass, and the supporting casts. You want to identify?
Yes, we have his daughter on the right, or to your left, depending where you are. So it's on the left of me.
Yeah.
That's right for you. And then we have Susan B. Anthony, which of course was a huge friend of Frederick Douglass, is a huge, important figure as a suffragette. And she obviously befriended Douglass. And next to him is Ottolin Assin, who was his German lover, introduced him to Hegel and to Goethe and to lots of German philosophical ideas, which is why I was thinking it's very interesting to have his statue in the park next to Goethe. But obviously, a lot of his ideas and philosophies were very much interpolated by their meeting, and she would translate his work into German as well.
Now tell us, you know, one of the biggest sort of challenges we immediately faced was, or you immediately faced, was who is going to play Frederick Douglass. And could you tell us a bit about Ray Farron? And because we're going to begin to see the actors in preparation as scenes are set and as you're working in the studio.
Well, first of all, Ray Farron sort of was familiar with Frederick Douglass. He is a kind of Black Royal Shakespeare Company actor. He's from the RSC, takes his acting incredibly seriously. And so he wanted to make sure that he had elocution lessons, at least for a month, in a certain Southern dialect that would have to be kind of 19th century orientated. He asked to see Celeste Barnier, who was a historian of Douglass, several times to meet up with her. I think it wasn't until actually he found out through reading his biographies that his interest in Shakespeare. And once that happened, it was like a kind of magic light bulb, you know, that he was indeed kind of Shakespearean writer. And I think between these knowledges, then he took very seriously his performance. And he is also very demanding as an actor. And like all good actors, you know, the director doesn't really direct good actors, you know, good actors direct themselves. And, you know, you just have to make sure you have the right camera movements, etc., and the rest follows. And he was exactly that. You know, rightly demanding to everybody associated with the production, including the costume designer and
We'll go
the
into
hair and makeup.
I mean, he so physically embodies how one imagines Douglas in terms of his stature, just his movement, and the facial expressions when he's giving the speeches.
Yes,
It's
I mean,
just
the costumes
the
are all
detail.
designed for him.
Everything was designed
Yeah.
for him. Now, here we have the Castle Gibson Studios. We have a lot to show. Now the Castle Gibson Studios is where you did studio shoots and set up scenes. I'm going to take us through some of these. Film. Now, it's very important to understand that Isaac was central to his thinking was to work with celluloid, with the basic material of the moving image is cinema, and then to move into the digital moving image. But this is always attached to this, as you saw in some of the earlier images, research into the history of film and the material of film. Now here's, why don't we talk a bit about setting up these scenes. I find that's the costume designer, right?
That's the costume design. That's me and her, you know, probably been told off by Ray in relation to a costume. But Annie is really one of the most important costume designers working in England today. And here we have an image of Nina Carlgren with her film crew who shot Looking for Langston and several other of my works. And then here is our studio, which is our version of a 19th century studio, which we meticulously, in a way, researched when we came to George Eastman House and had very interesting meetings with several scholars. And then, of course, Derek Brown, my art director, and Nina Carlgren got to town in how we would actually try to shoot the work. And so here we have arranged, as it were, the two cameras which we shoot simultaneously for multiple screen works. And we have, as it were, our own way of, as it were, seating when shots are being shot. Here you have discussion between Derek Brown and Nina Carlgren. Derek Brown was a costume art director for Looking for Langston and Youngster Rebels and some of my other works. And it seemed very important to bring back, what can I say, the old team. So here you have a sort of image of the studio. We have J.P. Ball, who was an African-American photographer, who's a very good friend of Frederick Douglass. As you know, Frederick Douglass was very sort of, you could say, obsessed with being photographed. And so kind of, it was really important to bring these two friendships together, his interest in photography and his artist friend, the photographer. And to a certain extent, you could say that these relations between photography and light, you know, is something very crucially played out in the work. So it's really a very strong collaboration, also with people involved in making tintype photographs, which exist at the beginning of the work, which were made by a specialist, Mr. Bohr, which was really funny to have the two Bohrs, one from the 19th century and one from the 21st century, involved in making the tintypes. And here is a mood board, which shows the way in which we're going to proceed in terms of making the actual studio and the photographic salon. The following shots are how we're constructing the various scenes of transportation, because of course the railroad is a very important conduit, both in the battle for slaves, as it were, sort of escaping to their freedom. The work that was done here in Rochester is incredibly dedicated to the work that Anna Murray Douglas did and Frederick Douglass did in terms of the railroad and how that plays an important function in slaves reaching to their freedom. And of course, when Douglass came to England and ended his time in Scotland for nearly 2 years, it would be a train that would allow him to make over 400 speeches during his time in England, which were all towards the abolition of slavery, and in the end, to a certain extent, guaranteed his own, as it were, liberation from being a slave, by the Richardsons, who were two Quakers who actually paid for his freedom, so he could return back to America no longer a fugitive slave. But I think it's really this question around photography and the relationship to the way that the parlor works in relationship to the way that, his main interest in photography, which was a really symbiotic relationship to my own making of images.
Yeah, I mean, there's that, very structural interest he has into the proliferation of these images and how they shape the imaginary and how they're seen, they create one's own consciousness is embedded in these images. And that's their great power. You have to look at the images, not just tell what the image is. You have to learn from it. And that's essentially what happens in this installation. I just want to say that you can begin to see here the elaboration of creating a shot, everything that's happening, the way the light comes into the room, the way the position that the actor takes, the gesture that the actor makes, how it's framed, cut, mobilized in not only a single scene. We haven't gotten to the fact that this is not a linear narrative projected on a single screen, but it's 10 screens, different positions, sizes, where you follow the action, are shaped by the action, just as you're shaped by the visual experiences you have in your daily life, in your world. And this is, it's a very subtle thing. We'll dig deeper into this, but it's very important just to see that this work isn't just happening that you see on the screen, but it's been created for you. And another point I want to make is that it's your experience with this work is learning from it, being challenged by it, remembering from it, returning to it. It's a whole circuit of knowledge. Before we were beginning, I was thinking to myself that this piece is really kind of a philosophical cinema, if you will, because it brings ideas. It brings in issues of representation and understanding. It brings knowledge. It's a kind of fluid movement as one experiences that as memory and direct experience. But let's get back to Isaac's talking. These scenes recreate the whole photographic process. And as you dictate, this is Anna.
Yeah, this is Anna Murray Douglas, and I kind of wanted to do an emphasis onto Anna Murray Douglas because, of course, she isn't the most photographed person of the 19th century. So I felt there was a way, at least within this work, we would try to equate a kind of attention to her visual representation. And this work will exist, not this image, but this series of images of her in the work will exist as a photographic work.
I thought it was quite remarkable, by the way, last night's dinner, it was quite remarkable. I was at a table with this woman who has been doing fantastic work on Anna Murray Douglas, and we saw the school today that's named after her for young people. Again, that's a wonderful thing about Rochester, is an activism to bring these things back, to remember them, to embed them in the life of a new generation so they feel the challenge. I mean, Frederick Douglass emerging out of slavery, the worst, the whip, the conditions. Remember, he talks in the, if those of you have seen the installation, he talks, I can show you the scars on my back, but I can't tell you how my soul has been constructed by this institution. I mean, it's just, so he's moving into his interior and into the exterior world. And again, that's what you're doing so eloquently with your installation. Oh, here he is. Oh, this is great. Explain this. This is the Lessons of the Hour, and what you invested just to make him write that so perfectly?
Well, Ray insisted that he needs to have a calligrapher.
Oh, of course.
Yes, you know.
Yes, make
You
it
know,
often.
if he was going to write Lessons of the Hour, there had to be a calligrapher, you know, lessons to write something that would be a kind of 19th century way of, you know, writing. So,
Fantastic.
Yeah. So, I mean, the attention to detail related to performance. But of course, you know, Frederick Douglass was a writer, and it was, of course, writing and his love of literature, which really was foundational to him. The fact that as a young boy, he was not learnt, you know, he was taught to read, but then punished and then taught himself. And I mean, if you go to his house today in Washington, I mean, there are books everywhere, you know, Les Miserables to the complete works of Shakespeare, they're all there.
I think we're. Oh, she did. This is fascinating. In the Washington home, you recreated a corner of the room where the actress playing Anna could be seen sewing and preparing his clothes.
Yes, because basically Anna was not only the person who enabled Douglass to escape slavery, she was the person who was actually not a slave herself. She was, you know, she was one of the few freed slaves. She was a Condé Bleu chef. She was an incredibly talented seamstress. She was a kind of economist. She looked after all of the actual financial arranging of
Big
Douglass.
family, too.
And the family on his long lectures. And she was incredibly important in terms of making sure about the presentational aspect of Douglass would be sort of attired in a way that would be fitting, you know. So, you know, the fact that we have these rather bright colors are kind of historically correct. You know, that he wore incredibly lavish costumes, which are all made by her. And I think her talents and sort of commitment was really a key aspect to the success of Douglass. And so, yes, this is one of the reasons why we wanted to kind of give her a kind of focus. Yeah, but
The casting also this reflects the original from the photographs. I mean, features.
Well, I worked with the same casting
Helen
director
Pitts.
who worked with Steve McQueen's first early works, Shame. And Gary is rather meticulous. You know, once he
fantastic.
told him we were going to do a work on Frederick Douglass, he went about casting for all the different actors, and, you know, everybody had to look absolutely like a copy of our protagonist that we were, of course, trying to emulate. And so, yeah.
So here's the Frederick Douglass National Historical Site in Washington, D.C., where you did some filming and documenting the individual objects in the room, in the space. it's quite extraordinary. It's meticulous, full of culture, his images, books. There's Othello. I mean, it's quite amazing.
I mean, it's an astonishing house, and of course, one would have filmed it here in Rochester, but that house was burnt down.
Yes.
So, in a way, all the things that they could save that they had in Rochester was brought to the house in Washington. And the fact that this house remains here to this day is an extraordinary feat that you could have preserved. This kind of 19th century house, which, you know, to a certain extent, isn't perhaps given the attention that it duly deserves. But with Kamal, the curator here, who very graciously allowed us to film within its domain and is an amazing historian of Douglas, along with Celeste. Here we have a photograph of Susan B. Anthony, who was there at Frederick Douglass' deathbed. They did argue, but they were friends in the end. And here we have a young Douglas. All of this is actually within the house itself. And so to be able to have the access to be able to film, here is a young Helen Pitts, who he controversially married. But actually, if it wasn't for Helen Pitts and her commitment to abolitionism and her commitment and devotion to her husband, that house would not be standing today. So she was the conservator of that house, and that house is standing today because of her efforts. Not her efforts alone, of course, it's all to do with, you know, the love of the surrounding black community of which this house stands upon. But the fact that we can go there today and have a violin which his son played on, to have a sheet of music that would have been played. And at one point when I was filming, I said to Kamal, well, obviously this can't be exactly how this statue was or how this painting was. And he would literally go to the archive, bring a photograph up, and it would be exactly the same as it was. You know, so he really, I mean, the dedication to the space is incredible.
Fantastic. Now, following my schedule here, I'm sort of the AV person to Isaac, but next we have the Royal Academy of Arts in London last year when you were shooting there. And again, the actresses. Tell about the Royal Academy in the interiors and how they work. Because now this is when he's coming to England, he's going to Scotland, he gets his abolitionists that help him become free person, and that all is happening in Great Britain.
Absolutely, yeah. And so, I mean, there's a twin thing that develops here because I became a Royal Academician last year, which allowed me to have lots of access that one wouldn't ordinarily have to the building. Yes, I want to make a film about Frederick Douglass. Please, can you move aside? I need to have these things here and that, and, you know, if you're a Royal Academician, you can do that, you know. So it meant that one could have access to filming in the Reynolds Room. We reconstructed J.P. Ball's photographic salon, and we basically were able to film in the rooms with with new technologies of lighting, where indeed it becomes, in a way, quite complicated to film in a space which has a certain conservation aspect to it. We had borrowed real daguerreotypes from Michael J. Wilson's collection in London, and we were able to also rearrange all the paintings and the photographic works according to how we had seen the various etchings of J.P. Ball's 19th century photographic salon. And of course, as you can see, there are lots of people involved in making the image.
Yeah, it's a real team. But they need, you know, it's a team that is motivated by the vision of the artist. You know, what details you want to represent, how you want that scene crafted. And that's the process, the dialogue that takes place between you as artists. You know, these are not just passive receptacles, I mean, these are people being challenged to fit and your master text that you want to see realized. Yeah, I mean, this is fantastic. This is to control the lighting in the room.
Yes, because if you're having very expensive paintings that are conserved, you can't just put a hot light onto them. So then, this is how we're able to light the room with this balloon light. And that would give a proper, equal kind of, if you like, lighting possibility for the whole space and enable us to do these tracking shot moves. And so there's a lot of preparation that goes into, how we're going to kind of make the image. And of course, there is a kind of politics and aesthetics of lighting, which is connected to the new technologies of being able to create a space where you have, as it were, the play between shadow and light. And here we have the image, which is the first image that you saw at this lecture, how we're constructing it. Their image is actually looking into a mirror. You're having to position the actual image in this way. Of course, the daguerreotypes is a kind of motif for the tintype, which is presented at the beginning of the exhibition. And there's something incredibly magical about the daguerreotypes in terms of their kind of chemistry and early technologies of photography, which of course fascinated Douglas.
Yeah, it fascinated Douglas, I think, in terms just of what it is as a photographic image, but what's interesting is how you translate the texture of that as cinema. I mean, there's an ambiance of the light, of the atmosphere in the room that evokes something about, like, you're looking through these, like you're into their space, into their imagination, into their lives. And here a display of some of these references. And here they are getting prepped for a shot, right? Oh, this is great, yeah.
So this is that David Chipperfield had redesigned the 19th century lecture hall, which opened the new wing of the Royal Academy last year. And as a Royal Academician, I could say, yes, I'd like to film in this hall, please.
Yes.
It's much more complicated than that, actually.
Oh, really?
In fact, we only had like about, 5 hours or something like that to shoot the whole scene. So this is where the kind of, if you like, militaristic part of shooting goes into operation. And I have to say that I was very proud of my team, because we were able to get everybody in that space and out really within 6 hours, and to shoot all of the scenes, which are the very important scenes, lecture and pictures, his what does the 4th of July mean to a slave, etc.
Yeah, fantastic.
And this is really where Ray also came into his own with an
fantastic.
audience.
Yeah, he loved that.
Yes, and the play between, as it were, a modern contemporary audience and having some characters which were actually in character.
I want to shift now to Edinburgh, the north, Scotland, where the sisters who were so instrumental in freeing him. And this is going on location, another location. I mean, there were so many locations. I mean, Jonathan would get these calls, right? Oh, I'm off at another place filming, and it's it again adds to the mise en scène of every scene in terms of what can happen. And tell us a bit about his love of horses.
Well, I had a conversation with Calvin about his book, The Heroic Slave, which is his novella. And I haven't actually read it, but I've read about it. Mm-hmm. And he was a naturalist. He was someone who was very much, horses, signified a great deal to him in this work. What I've tried to do is to create, if you like, animals and human beings as on the same level, so to speak. And yes, he was really, I think seeing the two parts of Frederick Douglass, both the private part of Frederick Douglass as someone who was a naturalist who knew this world firsthand, thinking about the relationship between also strange fruit in relationship to the way that he looked at nature.
That's fantastic.
And also really trying to mix between an image of the South and his time in Scotland. Here is a scene of Arthur's Peak.
I just want to go back to
Seat.
this, because I remember
Yeah.
you intercut into one of the screens, found footage that you had evoking the lynching.
Yeah.
So that, that gnarled, naturalistic form suddenly became something else. And again, it's that tension that opens up in these associations that you create across the screens. You don't just sort of become passive, you suddenly are challenged. And to see the pain and that animates his imagination and all of our lives as we think about what has happened across our history. This is beautiful. Oh, there he is. I didn't mean to interrupt you there. While we had the trees. Oh, now I have to ask you about this. You talk about Hegel and you talk about German Romanticism. I mean, this is Caspar David Friedrich, on the Peak. Was that a deliberate evocation of that
Yes,
painting?
of course.
Of course. Wouldn't it have been neat if it wasn't? Wow. No, but tell me about this a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that his time in Edinburgh was really important to him. Reading Lady of the Lake was very important to him. He was someone who was very, that knew a jig or two, on the violin, which was, his favorite instrument. And I mean, I think his time in Scotland was a time also when he got very depressed. He did have suicidal thoughts. He, it was a very difficult time being away from his family and having to, in a sense, survive. And I think it's also the space where he also is incredibly active and
Traveling constantly.
yes, and the whole unification politically of his campaign of send back the money, of getting the Free Church of Scotland to face up to trying to, in a way, get rid of the money from slavery and to really take a strong stand against it became very pivotal. So Edinburgh for him and Scotland was a kind of second home. And
This is nice.
well, this goes really back to George Eastman House because we met up with researchers there in relationship to how a backdrop would really look like if you were being photographed. That Douglass never had any pictorial landscapes behind him. But if there were pictorial landscapes, they would have been in black and white. In my work, they're in color. So it's just to note that it's been done on purpose. I do know the backdrops would have been in black and white.
Just the kind of research you were doing into the photographic process and the different instruments and tools, that firsthand experience.
Well, I'm thinking about these, stereoscopic instruments. I'm thinking about the way that we think about sort of, VR and all of that stuff.
Yes.
I mean, it's a kind of ongoing sort of optical, cognitive relationship. Nothing that new about it, but nonetheless something which we are obsessed with.
We're catching up with the inventions of the past. These are some installation planning. This is the composer, Paul Gladstone. I mean, sound. I mean, there's another whole dimension to this. The natural sounds that pick up, the composition of music that as motifs carry you and remind you. I mean, in a sense, watching those screens is like watching a composition unfold, a visual and auditory one. It's like a great orchestra that you're commanding of your images. And I thought Gladstone did a fantastic job.
Yeah, Paul Gladstone Reed is one of our very important black classical composers. He's encyclopedic about the knowledge of African American classical music, and he is really quite extraordinary in terms of, if you say to him, okay, I would like to have a score for this, he will kind of work by computer every single instrument and give you something which is 40 minutes long. So he's a kind of genius at composition. You might just need 4 minutes, but he's incredible, and he's incredibly excited about the project, and desperately wants to come to Rochester because, of course, it's the home of one of the most important music schools in the country, and he's an incredible composer, and he knew, Frederick Douglass's favorite classical music songs. He knew all about his time in Scotland. He knew all of these things, and instructed us, in fact, to how we would symphonically work things in relationship to the kind of musical approach to the work, along, of course, with Adam Finch.
Yeah, this is, now we have something that's really important, and that's all of this footage that we've been seeing, all of these studio scenes, all of these on location, all of this management of the construction of the moving image. These reels, if you will, come in and then are edited. And this is the composition, this is the putting it together, and how you can manage 10 screens of moving images and draw them together. Take us into this. Wow.
Well, the sound designer, Carl, had done the sound design for 10,000 Waves, and he's someone who is an extraordinary sound mixer, and he basically is able to take all our kind of sound montage decisions and to synthesize those into an experience in an auditorium that will, work in a kind of orchestral kind of manner. And so he is actually very good. He's one of the, so I'm very lucky to be able to work with him because he does quite big movies. So he's someone who's also quite experimental in his approach. And then we have the color grading of the work, where we work with Thomas, who color grades all the imagery. Most of it's shot on film, some of it's shot on digital. And here we have Adam Finch, who works on the kind of, what I call the kind of parallel montage, which is being able to work with montage in a dialectical fashion.
This is the heart of the whole, this is the moment of putting everything together.
It is, and because in a sense, Adam and I both went to St. Martin's School of Art and were trained by structuralist filmmakers, which we repudiated, but somehow some of the sort of ideas of thinking about sort of being able to work with montage in a way which is not strictly narrative lives on in different versions of expanded cinema, and then being able to work with Celeste, who is the historian of Frederick Douglass,
Wrote the biography.
was incredibly important. And then also, of course, we come to the thinking of the work and how it's going to be installed. But thinking of the work and how it's going to be installed has to be thought of before.
There's a sketch. That's the sketch.
That's my de rigueur sketch for the use of screens and this salon hang approach to thinking about how the screens will work in tandem to one another. Of course, it's very deliberate if one screen is smaller and another screen is larger, and how you distribute and create a kind of scenography of images. And we're very much thinking about this symphonic way of working with the imagery.
Well, there you go. That takes you from across an extraordinary path, creative journey, a creative path of realizing this fantastic piece that's now part of the MAG collection. And Isaac, I want to thank you again for really opening this up to all of us.
Thank you.
Not bad.
We do have time for questions from the audience. Andrew and Chio are in the aisles here, walking with a microphone. If you have a question, raise your hand. Don't be shy. Ask it into the microphone, and everybody will be able to hear you. In the back corner there, Chio. All right.
Thank you so much for collaborating with Rochester. I think there is a collaborator in the room, Olivia Kim, who has done the sculpture of Frederick Douglass. Is she here? All right. Give it up for Olivia.
Hello, I'm very scared. I'm very curious. I just saw your piece today, and I was just wondering, how personally did you take this project? How did it affect you as a person? I'm just very curious about that. Because it's, as a director, right, there's a certain amount of distance that you have to have in order to have the complete vision, but how are you affected by this?
Well, I think first of all, in a way, I think, if you go to film school or if you go to, there's an idea that you're meant to have a distance on a piece of work to be able to make a piece of work, which I think to a certain extent you do, but to a certain extent I perhaps would not really agree with that position, because I think I never just make works. All the works that I make, I have to be 100% involved in them. And so it involves a great deal of commitment, both for myself, and I also ask that from everybody who works with me. And so I think, in a way, I really wouldn't do a project. I'd never ever do a project if it's not something which I am kind of completely over-invested in, so, and I think with Frederick Douglass, as I said, I think, that his life is very moving. The challenge is like, how can you do justice to Frederick Douglass, do you know what I mean? Really, so, yeah.
Why Ottilie? Why did you include her in this? What was your thinking behind Ottilie Assing?
Well, I think that Ottilie Assing is an incredible protagonist in Douglass's life, and she's someone who is a collaborator with Douglass. She knew the Douglasses incredibly well. She came to Rochester. She came to Washington. Over a 24-year period. She's someone who expected to marry Douglass, after Anna had passed away. But I think, she is someone that exposed him to, German ideas, and translated his work into German. So I think it's an incredibly creative and productive relationship. He taught one of his daughters German. So I think she is an incredibly important figure in Douglass's life. But there are many important women in Douglass's life, and Douglass was someone who was, suffragette himself to a certain extent, even though there would be disagreements and quarrels, and he would choose one his race over another. But I think, that, certainly at the end of his life, I think those things were made amends. Yeah, I mean, I think Othling Asin is an incredibly important character.
Putting it together with all the different screens, and we see you looking at the screens, and you're dealing with editing the different screens and the sound and all of that, but because it's in 3D and the screens aren't flat and they're not the way that I'm just curious, here in Rochester after this week and this installation, you're really kind of seeing it for the first time, even yourself, in this three-dimensional version. And are there things that you're surprised by, things that you're disappointed in? Is it as you imagined it? Would you tinker with it if you could? Sorry.
Well, I think, the way, yes, tinkling can always be a good idea. No, but I think there's a way in which for example, in some works, when I'm making them, we install them when we come to a certain part of it, and we install the work, and we see how it works in its physicality. And so I would say for a work like 10,000 Waves, we did that. We invited Victoria Miro Gallery and people from our studio, and I think they probably thought it was a bit weird. We said, walk around this installation and tell us what you think about it. And we would install it, and from their reaction, we'd be able to say, this part doesn't work. It's a bit like screen testing, what they do in Hollywood, right? You can see which bits work, which bits doesn't work. But in this work, we didn't do that, because in a sense, we didn't have the time to do it. But then, yes, when we installed it, it did take some time. I did have to look at it rather a lot. I do think Jonathan thought to myself, he's in the space quite a lot, viewing, because you have to view it to see how it really works. It only really comes alive once there's an audience. So I think yesterday, when there's an audience and the sound is able to be increased, then it can have its effect, so to speak. But it took quite a lot of, but the installation here is really quite meticulous. And there's certain things which you really needed to do, like the red light on the carpet.
Yes.
There's lots of little minute things which brings the piece alive, So, but we're very excited. When we install the piece in Metro Pictures in New York next week, where it's been installed now, we're working more with the verticality of the space. So it would be different again, and that's also very exciting, to be able to install it differently. And ideally, it'd be great to install it differently, in every space you do it, and that would be the real fun of making the work. Yep.
And hopefully it'll be here on a fairly permanent basis in another space of the museum. I know Jonathan's working toward that idea. It's fantastic, because it has such a presence and it so embodies this person and this community and everything else, and it's great.
Because it'd be great for it to be in the blue room, for example, rather than the red room. Maybe we'll do that in Virginia.
Thank you.
I do have a question. Do you want to talk about the content and the sort of overlay or collapsing of time between the Frederick Douglass era and Baltimore that is a more recent time period?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're working a lot with in the work is the question of time and temporality. And so when we were making the project, we wanted to really create this sort of, mid-19th century world. But we know that we're kind of only partly playing with that, because in the scene where you have the audience, everybody, they're more or less contemporary, but there's a few people who are dressed in the 19th century fashion. But because architecturally you're in this sort of hall, which is a kind of 19th century design, it doesn't necessarily immediately register, but when you come to the finale of the work, then you are moved into the 21st century. And that's really important because it's really about trying to make Douglas reverberate for today, for a contemporaneous audience, and to say that some of the questions that he posed are not so dissimilar to questions posed today. And I think it's a question of what then are the ways of seeing today, you know. So in a way, his thesis around photography and the way that functions, I think, you know, one can think about the ways of seeing today through the new technologies and the way in which those technologies come at you from everywhere, which he speaks about in photography in the 19th century. But of course, you know, technology does change. You know, it's just really about what technology is doing today. So in his speech, he's talking about what does the 4th of July mean to the slave. And I think, you know, we could say, how does America signify today in relationship to the apparatus that's used to police populations and the kind of technological use of drones and these sorts of technologies and ways of seeing. So the black and white footage is from the FBI of a sort of demonstration that took place in Baltimore near to where he grew up in Philpott Avenue. And then Chesapeake is the kind of drone shots going over the bay, which he talks about those spaces being where he witnessed ships with slave cargo on them. And so it's really about sort of thinking about those spaces, how they resonate today, and how, you know, we have those histories which we're erasing, you know, through, yeah.
Right.
So that all those sorts of ideas.
I mean, for me, that's that question is it's the great set piece for me in the work. I mean, I am so moved by the protests around Freddie Gray's murder, the emergence of Black Lives Matter. You feel just coming from the streets, this black and white surveillance imagery, and then this evocation of high capitalism, the sugar cane, I mean, to Trans-America on the top of a building. I mean, it's just, and then that home movie footage of the July 4th, the arrogance, I mean, the children, I mean, the detail is so fantastic. And it really brings back to what you just said, this issue that every place has a memory, every place has a history, every place is connected to this terrifying story that Douglas is evoking through his writings, his speeches, and his work. So to me, that is, I get chill every time I watch that. I'm just so moved. I get moved even talking about it. It's just so effective and powerful. Thank you for that.
I just wanted to say welcome to Rochester, Mr. Julian. And last year, of course, we were celebrating the 200th birthday of Frederick Douglass. This year, we've got the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first documented Africans here in America. What do you, what would you say about the significance of your work being unveiled in this year of that anniversary?
Well, I think, you know, sometimes, you know, I was talking to my partner Mark about this, and I was saying, well, sometimes you make works, but sometimes when you make works, you know, you're exposing yourself to a certain extent. And we were trying to discuss about what is this exposing feeling, you know. And Mark responded, well, you know, race is kind of like the elephant in the room, you know. And I think, you know, in a way, if race is the elephant in the room, then I think slavery is the kind of taboo kind of subject You know, when you have like a culture that was built so much on that as a kind of, you know, epistemic system, you know, and so I think it's, yeah, I mean, maybe, you know, I'm going to be 60 next year, so maybe it's taken me to, I'm nearly 60, to make a work that deals with this subject, you know. So I think it's sort of, you know, in a way, I think with Frederick Douglass, you know, he is someone that you have to think about what he was involved in. You know, we think about this time as being, you know, not the best time, but I mean, seriously, in his time, you know, we're talking about someone who made these kind of proclamations, where basically, you know, we don't, it's almost like those proclamations today resonate in such a particular manner, you know, and I think we maybe haven't done the work of really listening to this time, you know, and what it really is to a culture. I mean, you know, I have, you know, CBE, Commander of the British Order of British Empire, whatever it's called, you know, and when this first came, you know, many people said to me, Isaac, you're not going to take that, are you? You know, and, you know, in a way, it's kind of, you know, in a way, in England, you know, well, yes, it is. I mean, at the end of the film, it talks about Douglas escape, you know, leaves, you know, Republican America,
Yes.
the slave returns from monarchical England, the free man, and there is still a monarchy in England. And so I think there's a way in which, you know, the questions of, we can't really escape questions of empire and what they signify because they're still with us, you know, but they're with us in this very, you know, there's not really, there's still so many conversations to be had. And I think until we can have those conversations about what those things really signify, then there's going to be this kind of continual kind of repetition, you know. So I think it's a kind of work, and like the Return of the Repressed, the unconscious, it comes back to haunt the present, and I think that's what's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, if I might add, you have this feeling that that was then, maybe walk around all day thinking, oh, that was then, this is now. And I think what you're saying is, this is who we are. And whether it's monarchical England or Republican America, but it's a very powerful point, I think, to end on. I want to thank all of you for coming today. I want to thank John and Isaac for their incredible conversation. Thank you very much.
That went well. Was I okay?
It was great, Tom. That was so good, wasn't
Oh, but
it?
you're so good.
It was good to go
Actually,
through.
the images were perfect.
They were great, weren't they?